And now I want to hand it over to the president of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. We're going to beat President Putin. President Zelensky.
Mixing up the name of Ukraine's leader with that of his arch-enemy was what you'd call a senior moment from the 81-year-old US President Joe Biden.
NBC News has learned President Biden will step aside as the presumptive Democratic nominee. He will suspend his bid for a second term.
NBC shouting in its headline, "He's too old to win," struggling to finish a sentence or complete a thought. And it wasn't just NBC's narrative.
Let's face it. President Biden, in my opinion, I've said this before publicly, is too old for this job.
Biden's age problem isn't going away.
It's not only his age, it's that his cognitive capabilities are severely diminished.
Is too old for a second term.
Biden's age is a concern.
But his rival is only a couple of years younger.
We do need to talk about a presidential candidate who is very old, who struggles with remembering things, who sometimes has trouble even forming basic sentences, a candidate who will be the oldest American president in history by the end of his term. But Biden's not the guy I'm talking about here. No, I'm actually talking about his presumed Republican opponent next year, 77-year-old former President Donald J. Trump.
The Mueller report, I wish, covered the oranges, how it started. In the failing New York Times by an anonymous, gutless coward. They sacrifice every day for the furniture, future of their children. I know words, I have the best words.
The pair of them are not exactly international poster boys for ageing well.
It reinforces, unfortunately, all those stereotypes we have about, well, they can't do that anymore. They're no good. They're going to fluff their words or whatever. Are they capable and competent?
But there are plenty of other people who are showing the world that age doesn't have to be a barrier. At the New York Marathon, for example.
At 87, Garth Barfoot was the oldest competitor in the race, which is some feat given he's undergone 4 hip replacements just to get there.
In the new movie Thelma.
Well, the title character is played by June Squibb. She's an actress who made the leap from stage to screen when she was 61. But this is her first leading role at the age of 94.
And down at the club.
Practice makes perfect for the world's oldest club DJ, 83-year-old DJ Sumarock. She's been spinning for a decade and now has a regular gig at a Tokyo night spot.
I'm Alexia Russell, and today on The Detail, we're talking about ageism. We're currently in the middle of what's being designated as the UN Decade of Healthy Ageing, which, like the elderly sector in general, seems to have gone under the radar. A new think tank and advocacy group, the Aotearoa New Zealand National Forum for the Decade of Healthy Ageing, aims to change that. It's made up of a number of groups from the sector, including the Selwyn Foundation, whose CEO is Denise Cosgrove.
We're a foundation that is totally focused on improving outcomes for older people. A foundation is a grant-making organisation, so we don't do the services ourselves. We actually support people in the community who are doing really good things for vulnerable older people.
It's work that was started 70 years ago with the first city missioner that showed the tragic plight of older people in insecure housing back then.
And really what was experienced then is still happening today, which is really unfortunate. So, people living in substandard housing without water, without amenities, with no money, and poverty. So health, housing, all of the areas were numbered in their thousands then. But we did some research a year or so ago, and that number is 37,500 older people in Auckland and Northland alone experiencing multiple disadvantage across all those domains of well-being. So that's really, it's going to get worse. In less than 5 years, there'll be 1 million people over 65 in New Zealand. Well, 1 in 5 of us. Yeah.
So I'd never heard of the foundation before, but you're making a push at the moment, because tell me about this UN decade. is that all about?
So the UN Decade, it started a couple of years ago, so we're a little bit behind, but we learnt about it through our contacts at the Office for Seniors and Age Concern. And really it's a platform for change. And it's about actually people realising that the world is changing, that there are getting more older people, and that we actually need to address this in a way that is going to enable people to age well and to live healthier lives for longer. So one of the key things here is that actually they've got some cross-cutting areas and some key focus areas, the main one of which is combating ageism. So the Selwyn Foundation, we see our role as basically convening, brokering, supporting. So we pulled together anyone who was interested across the sort of older person's sector, Age Concern, Grey Power, government agencies, all sorts of people have come to our couple of meetings that we've had to talk about how we could activate the platform for change in New Zealand. And so we've set up a national forum for Aotearoa New Zealand, the Decade of Healthy Ageing. And if you go down and have a look at the UN Decade, it's just an absolute goldmine of exciting and interesting things about ageing on all sorts of levels, some quite tragic and some quite empowering, about stories of communities and older people really embracing ageing and supporting their older people.
The decade focuses on changing how we think, feel and act towards ageing, cultivating age-friendly environments, creating responsive healthcare systems and services, and promoting long-term care and support essential to living with meaning and dignity.
Like Japan has really taken this, but most people know that, and they're looking to create an ageless society. They had a larger demographic of people aging.
Japan is the fastest aging society in world recorded history. There is just no precedent for the speed of aging in Japan, right? People who turn 100, we are now at 26,000 of these, are going up about double every 5 years, which is staggering statistic.
So they've been really embracing this issue for a long time, looking at, long-term care, looking at age-friendly environments. How do you make your environment so that people can move around the city? Auckland City is doing some really great stuff in that regard. So it's really, really interesting. But the main thing we think is probably a big driver for change is ageism.
How at 78 you are the future of this country.
What an ageist, arrogant statement.
There are parts of our communities and parts of our the cultures within our communities that have a very inclusive and, life course approach. So particularly Māori, Pacifica, some Asian cultures as well. And then there are other cultures that don't. But if you recall, probably when my mother, who's 91, was born, they were in a community themselves. They looked after their older people as well as their younger people. They were on a farm, so you had no alternative. And also that was just the way people did. So somewhere in the middle, we're possibly, urbanisation, all sorts of other, you can talk about colonisation, all sorts of things. Maybe those family units or those constructs, those societal constructs have become a bit broken. We're worried about things like social isolation and loneliness. People who are lost, who are disconnected. That whole question around, we think that there's some particular issues of ageing as a woman who's not in a relationship any longer, and what that's meaning for people. You have a financial shock later in life, and suddenly you're alone, you're ageing, you can't find a job. You need to work till you're 75 or older, and you need to live somewhere, and you can't get into social housing or housing because people consciously or subconsciously are making judgments about who you are and unconscious bias and things like that.
Is that the biggest demographic, the older single woman?
It's definitely an emerging one. As we probably know, the stats show that women tend to live longer than men. And what we're seeing is really a larger number of women coming through who do, as I say, have a financial shock, death, divorce, whatever it happens, end up older with nothing. I know some really tragic stories and people, but you wouldn't pick them. There's a woman I was with the other day, she's dressed like me in a suit. She works, she's 75. She's literally lived out of a suitcase for 13 years, couch surfing, living in people's homes, trying to do everything to not end up on the street because that's so fundamentally unsafe. So, there's stories like that are here, that are happening in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and how do we address those? And what's holding people kind of stuck in those circumstances is ageism. So they say, can't get a job, can't get a place to live, can't get enough money to save to get the rent deposit.
It took 8-9 months. I could not believe it. That nothing could come up that was halfway decent. Everything was quite shabby and expensive, or so much competition. 20 people would be turning up at each flat that was even halfway decent.
Katrina Chandra is one of those older single women who's discovered that finding a place to live for one is a nightmare.
Back in the day, it used to be a very easily done thing to find somewhere to flat. But I think the things that are standing in the way of someone such as myself these days is that it's almost impossible to live by yourself because of the cost of a single, even just a studio can be upwards over $400 a week just for the rental. And then who you might be flatting with, young people don't want to flat with older people. It's too much like living with your parents.
And you didn't find that people would look at you and think, oh yeah, an older woman should look after the place? That wasn't the case?
Well, it could be couples, and in fact, people would offer more than the stated price. So it's really hard to sort of get in there and make your voice heard, make you the special one to get the place.
So what did you do? Where did you go?
In the end, another friend was looking for a place. And as I said, you just can't get a place with one person, a nice place for one person. And the cost of it, when you're sharing, it's half for everything that you're paying for. So another friend that was looking for a place, a guy, and I got a place together, which, is better than I could have got for a single person price.
But until then, Katrina relied on friends to stay with. And if they happened to live in the country, she'd work remotely as much as possible in what she calls a transitory lifestyle.
I think it's definitely age is playing a part now because, again, not just 20-year-olds, but 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds. And there's plenty of them, to be out there against.
So you're saying that when money's tight, age becomes more of a factor in things like looking for a house?
Yeah, because you might be less reliable than a couple with a child, or they want people that are going to pay more or that are going to be longer term, maybe like a family. I've flatted my whole life, and Easter last year, getting into this house was the longest period of time it's ever taken me to find a house.
She's moving to Perth this week, where she hopes it'll be easier to find a place to live.
I've always been quite nomadic, but as you get older, you just want to sort of settle more, I suppose.
What did it feel like to sort of constantly be occupying someone's spare room?
Oh, yes. It's so tricky to live out of a suitcase for so long. You never settled. You don't have everything in its own place. It's just in a bundle of something. It's a young person's life to be moving all the time, I think.
It's a mystery to Katrina why property managers are so reluctant to let a place to a single older woman. Denise Cosgrove says society needs to address ingrained attitudes towards older people.
I think the first thing is really looking at ourselves. So what is it that you are unconsciously or consciously thinking, feeling and doing in relation to older people? So do you assume certain stereotypes, all older people can't drive, all older people can't use tech? Is that true? My 84-year-old uncle just bought an iPhone 14 this week. He's been using tech for 30 years. He's better than I am, and so was my father. These are just stereotypes that we're holding on to. But that causes us to look at older people in different ways. The other biggie is that we suddenly turn 65 and we just become part of this massive amorphous group of people from 65 to 105. Somehow we kind of just create this group, and we don't segment, we don't look at what's important for people as they age and stage. But we do that when you're younger, from 0 to 65. We can pretty much tell you what stage they're at and what they're doing, but we certainly don't do much for people older. And those are some of the things we can do through the decade, is really look at segmenting data, but really focusing on what's different for people and what are the pathways, where are the supports.
But, we're not all swinging superannuates, are we? I mean, a lot of people, sure, they've got their marbles and they're doing amazing things, but there are people who, they're full of arthritis, so they don't like pushing the buttons on the tech, or they are starting to get dementia and they're becoming a bit dazed and confused. I mean, how do we sort of help those people without lumping every old person into that boat?
The ability for people to age in community is really, really important, and it's an issue we haven't been dealing with yet. So there's been a bit of work by government agencies and Ministry of Health, others, around looking at what's needed in terms of the provision of care. There's plenty of people out there talking about the lack of care beds. There will never be enough care beds, and the reality is most people want to age and die in their own community. So how do we enable that? And so, we need to work on those kind of really big, meaty problems in New Zealand, which we haven't really been addressing yet. So how do we all rethink about ageing? How do we think about looking after those who need more support? You talk about people with dementia. There's still some really cool tech things about how people can perimeter monitoring and things like that, where people can still be safe.
Right, but like the trolley in the supermarket, they can't go past the car park.
Yeah.
So, I mean, maybe do we need to have does this need to come from on top? Does the government need to look at legislation where new housing developments, for example, have a part where perhaps a rest home's incorporated into it instead of left on the outskirts of it?
Yeah, well, there's a pilot, I think, in Queenstown of inclusionary housing, which is where a proportion of a development is agreed that will be available for social housing or older persons housing. So there's some examples that are quite cool. I mean, at the end of the day, government can't solve all the issues, as we know. So it's people like us that could step forward. The National Forum is a group of the interested players who are all trying to rethink, reimagine, look at different ways, where we can fund trials or supports. We had an innovation challenge last year, which was great, got 108 applications from people who are trialling new tech or other things to support vulnerable older people. And there's lots of really cool things that, not just tech-based, that can help people age for longer in their own communities.
New Zealand has an ageing workforce. In fact, a third of employees are over 55. With that life experience comes tons of knowledge, wisdom and motivation. And yet a recent survey shows 33% of Kiwi companies are worried about the impact on their business of the ageing population. What's more, 80% had no specific strategies or policies to recruit or retain older workers.
Is there still that block about employing older people?
I definitely think there is. From my own experience, I have an octogenarian working for me who actually leads out on this. She's a strategic advisor for this decade of healthy ageing stuff. Fantastic, And so I don't sit there thinking, she might retire one day. I just think I can optimise that contribution for as long as possible. I often look at younger people and maybe they don't stay as long with employers as others too. So
off overseas all the time.
Yeah. So, so I think that if we try to treat everyone as just one homogenous group, then we lose the fact that there are lots of people who need to keep working, who have valuable skills and contributions, who can use tech, and, who will probably be more loyal because they've actually decided they want to keep working than maybe other people. What we've also learnt through this stuff around through the decade and things around ageing is that self-ageism is one of the worst things. So
how do you mean?
What you think yourself? Oh, well, I can't do that because I'm getting older, or they wouldn't look at me because I'm older, or if I
rolling yourself out of stuff.
Yeah, if I don't dye my hair, then they'll think I'm older. All of those kind of things is actually our own unconscious or conscious biases that are seeping in to inhibit our own action, which is also really interesting. It's quite a known thing.
Self-sabotage.
Yeah.
What are some myth busters that you'd like to Tell me about. I mean, come on, older people aren't great drivers, really, are they?
My father used to say, "Beware of an older person wearing a hat," and then he became that person. So he then realised that actually wasn't quite correct. That you can't just make a stereotype that you got a hat on, that you're therefore a poor driver. And what also happened, he was a big driver all his life. You know, he drove buses, he drove taxis. When he lost his licence, that was actually the most profound thing for him. That was actually cut him right to the core. It was when he realised his own sort of ageing, his own mortality, all those kind of things. So, you know, there's those kind of assumptions, and we all probably do them, you know, and you've got to kind of stop yourself all the time. But my big one is about tech. I'm absolutely useless at tech, but it's not because I'm older.
It's just not your thing.
Yeah. I would say probably the older cohort, you know, my mother's group and maybe 10 years earlier than that, it's really challenging. You know, when the checks stopped, she found that really, really hard. My brother, who, you know, supports her mostly, he helps her with that tech thing. But you get the flip side, which is elder abuse.
Nairi sold her house. Her son persuaded her to put the money in his bank account. He plans to buy her a house near him. Nairi wants a home closer to her grandchildren. She says he just won't listen, and her friends are worried.
That don't understand how to navigate the system yourself, open to other people to abuse it. You know, that's really, really challenging.
Well, I mean, you can't blame a 90-year-old for not trusting digital banking, for example. You know, it was maybe okay when they did telephone banking, but there have been so many scams and so many, you know, older people scammed out of money.
And they asked me would I go into the computer and they would show me where the problem was, which was not good, convincing, which I did. And then after some time, they asked me questions about my bank accounts and did I have bank accounts and who were they with, and I told them.
Do they need to be upskilled, or do we need to start thinking about, okay, we actually do need to have a person staffing this bank, or, you know what I mean?
I think it's always a balance, isn't it? You know, I think there's always a role for a face-to-face person who can support someone, whether it's with those kind of activities at a bank or whether some other service, or even just navigating the health system. I don't know about you, but I figure I'm relatively competent at that, but trying to help my mother or other older people find out how to get around various systems is really, really hard. And I don't mean just the tech system, I mean the actual navigation process of how do you get access to a benefit, how do you do this, all those kind of things are really difficult. So I think I've always say it's a bit of both, isn't it? It would be great to still have face-to-face for people who really need it. And then there's lots of really good stuff that can enable people to live longer and live well and stay in their communities for longer, which are tech-based. So, you know.
Bit of both. By the end of this decade, 2030, what would you like to have seen changed?
I think attitudes towards ageing, so that I love the concept of Japan, you know, the ageless society. You know, is age important? Does it matter how old I am? Does it matter what my age is? You know, because then you've started already to add a judgment to who I am and what I'm about and what I can do or not do. So let's just get rid of age. And let's think about the life stages that we go through. Some will get to them earlier than others for a whole bunch of different reasons. And, you know, our paths will go quite differently. And so that would be great from my point of view, is if New Zealand really embraced this concept of being ageless, is looking for ways to encourage people at all ages to flourish in communities that support them. We all will age. That's a given. And so we're all in this together. I think what's really interesting is that we all want to live longer, but no one wants to get old.
That's it for today. The Detail's a newsroom production made with the support of RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Today's episode was engineered by William Saunders and produced by Gwen McClure. Thanks to Denise Cosgrove and Katrina Chandra. I'm Alexia Russell. Ka kite.